I woke up to my mother's voice in the hallway outside my hospital room, and she wasn't talking to a nurse. She was talking to a man about closing costs. I'd been under anesthesia for 6 hours after a car accident on I-44 outside Tulsa left me with internal bleeding and a shattered femur. I'd been in a medically induced coma for 4 days after that, to let the swelling in my brain go down. 4 days where my parents had access to my house, my mail, and as it turned out, a power of attorney I signed 8 years ago and completely forgot existed. By the time I opened my eyes for real, they had already accepted an offer on my house. The house my husband's life insurance paid for. The house I lived in, alone, since Mark died. $425,000. And they were 3 days from closing. I want to tell you what happened after that call in the hallway, but you need to understand who I am first, and how a woman ends up in this position without ever seeing it coming. Welcome back to Frontline Retribution, the channel for quiet people who get pushed 1 inch too far and the moment the truth finally walks through the front door. If you've ever been the one who showed up when nobody was watching, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My name is Dana. I'm 34. I grew up in Broken Arrow, just outside Tulsa, in a house where my father ran a small vac repair business and my mother kept the books badly. I have one brother, Curtis, 2 years older, who has always been the golden child in a family that didn't have much gold to go around. I met Mark in nursing school. He was studying to be a paramedic. I was studying to be an RN. And we got married the summer we both graduated. 4 years later, a drunk driver crossed the median on Highway 75, and Mark didn't make it home. I was 29. The settlement and his life insurance came to just under $600,000, and I used most of it to buy a 3-bedroom house on Newcastle Street in a quiet part of Broken Arrow, the kind of house Mark and I always said we'd have kids in someday. I never remarried. I put myself into work at St. Francis Hospital, picked up extra shifts in the ICU, and built a life that was small, but mine. That house was the only thing that felt like it still belonged to the two of us. My parents' financial situation had been shaky for years, but it got worse about 3 years ago when my father put almost everything into a franchise opportunity, a specialty auto parts store that failed within 18 months. He never told anyone the full extent of it. I found out slowly, the way you find out most things in my family, sideways, through a comment my mother made about a temporary rough patch, or a call from a collections agency that accidentally reached my number instead of theirs. What nobody knew, not my father, not my mother, not even Curtis, was that I had been quietly covering their mortgage payment every month for almost 2 years. $640, automatic transfer, first of the month, out of my own account. I never told them it was me. I told my mother once that I'd heard from a credit counselor friend that they should look into refinancing, and let her think that was the extent of my help. I didn't want gratitude. I wanted them to keep the house they raised me in, and I didn't want it to become a thing we talked about at every holiday. I still think about what happened after that should have been my warning that quiet generosity in my family was never seen, it was just expected. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March. I was driving home from a double shift, exhausted, and a truck crossed 3 lanes without braking. I don't remember the impact. I remember waking up in an ICU bed 4 days later with my mother's face the first thing I saw, and thinking, for one confused second, that she looked relieved rather than worried. I didn't understand why at the time. I do now. While I was unconscious, my parents told the hospital they were my emergency contacts, which was true, and my medical proxy, which was also true, Mark and I had set that up years ago, and after he died, I never updated it. Because updating paperwork is the kind of thing you do when you think you have time. What they also had, buried in a folder from 8 years earlier, was a general power of attorney I'd signed the year Mark and I bought a rental property together. Back when we needed someone to sign closing documents if one of us couldn't make it to the title office. Mark passed away. The rental property was sold years ago, and I genuinely forgot that piece of paper still existed. My father did not forget. My father kept a folder. The morning after I went into the coma, my father called Curtis, not to update him on my condition, but to ask if he remembered the paperwork from the rental thing. Curtis, to his credit, thought it was strange. But he didn't ask more questions. He had no reason to think our father was doing anything except managing my affairs, while I was unable to. By day 2, my parents had contacted a real estate agent, a friend of my father's from church, about listing my house on Newcastle Street. By day 3, they had a cash offer from an investor looking to flip properties in that part of Broken Arrow. $425,000. All cash. 10-day close. My father told the agent I had authorized this before my accident, in case anything happened to me. Which was a lie built on top of a legal technicality. The power of attorney existed. What it authorized was ambiguous at best. My father decided to interpret it as broadly as possible, because he owed $41,000 to a business partner from the failed franchise, and that partner was threatening to sue. I still think about what happened next should have been my warning, except I wasn't there to see any warning signs. I was in a hospital bed, with a shattered leg, breathing through a machine, while my house was being sold out from under me by the 2 people who were supposed to protect it. What saved me wasn't luck. It was something I'd done years before, without ever thinking of it as protection. When Mark and I bought the Newcastle Street house together, our attorney, a careful, old-fashioned man named Robert Ashcroft, who'd handled Mark's estate after the accident, had insisted we place the property into a living trust, mostly for tax and inheritance reasons. After Mark died, I kept the trust in place, mostly out of inertia. I was the sole trustee and sole beneficiary. But Robert had written one clause into that trust. Years earlier, almost as an afterthought, any sale of the property required a notarized signature from the trustee, verified in person, with Robert's office copied on the closing documents. It wasn't there to stop my parents. It was there because Robert didn't trust real estate agents to double-check paperwork, and he'd seen too many families get sloppy. I had no idea how wrong my father was to think this would be simple. 3 days before closing, the title company's processor, a woman named Sherry, who had worked with Robert's office for over a decade, noticed the closing documents referenced a trust, but the required attorney sign-off from Robert's firm wasn't attached. She called Robert's office as a formality. Robert Ashcroft, 71 years old and still sharp as anyone I've ever met, immediately knew something was wrong, because he had never received a call from me, and he had personally handled every piece of paperwork on that house since 2019. Robert drove to St. Francis Hospital himself. I was still in the coma. He sat with a nurse, confirmed my condition, and then made 2 phone calls. One to freeze any transaction on the trust property, and one to Curtis, my brother, whose number he still had from Mark's estate paperwork. That next phone call explained everything to Curtis, and Curtis, for the first time in his life, didn't take our father's side. I woke up on day 5. The first person I saw who wasn't hospital staff or my mother was Curtis, sitting in the chair by the window, looking like he hadn't slept. "Dana," he said, "did you agree to sell the house?" I didn't understand the question. I asked him what he meant, and he told me. All of it. The power of attorney, the real estate agent, the offer, the 10-day close that was supposed to happen in 2 days. I want to tell you I felt rage first. I didn't. I felt the specific, hollow fear of realizing that the people who raised you had decided, at some point, that you were an obstacle rather than a daughter. The lowest point wasn't the moment I found out. It was 3 days later, once I was moved out of the ICU and into a regular room. Still unable to walk, still on pain medication that made my thoughts slow and thick, and I had to call Robert Ashcroft myself from a hospital bed to ask him to explain, slowly, exactly what my parents had tried to do to me, while I couldn't speak for myself. I remember the food tray going cold beside me because my hands were shaking too hard to eat. I remember my mother texting me that evening, not to apologize, but to say your father is under a lot of stress. Please don't make this bigger than it needs to be. I remember staring at the ceiling of that hospital room, unable to walk to the bathroom without help, thinking about the 2 years of $640 transfers I'd sent to keep their house standing. Money they never knew came from me, while they'd spent 4 days trying to sell mine. Nobody called to check if I was in pain. Nobody asked if the surgery had gone well. Every call from my parents that week was about the house, about misunderstandings, about how the investor might walk away and leave them in an even worse position. I had sacrificed quietly for 2 years, and the only acknowledgement I ever got was an attempt to take more. The turning point came when Robert visited me in person, 10 days after the accident, once I was more lucid. He brought a folder, the original power of attorney, the trust documents, and a printed email chain between my father and the real estate agent, forwarded to him by Sherry at the title company, who felt something was deeply wrong and wanted a paper trail in case anyone asked questions later. Robert laid it out plainly. The power of attorney was old, narrow in its original intent, and legally questionable applied to a trust property with a specific override clause. My father's use of it wouldn't have held up if I contested it, and the moment I woke up and objected, the sale was void. Robert had already sent formal notice to the title company and the buyer's agent rescinding any authorization. "You're protected," he told me. "You were protected the whole time. You just didn't know it." That was the moment I understood the trust clause Robert insisted on all those years ago, the one I barely remembered signing. The one that felt like unnecessary paperwork at the time was the only reason I still had a house to come home to. The comeback wasn't loud. I didn't scream at my parents. I didn't need to. 3 weeks later, once I was home and using a walker to get around my own kitchen, I asked my parents to come to Robert's office. Curtis came too, along with my mother and father, who I think expected an apology conversation, a chance to smooth things over the way they'd smoothed over every crisis before. Robert laid the documents on the table. The forged interpretation of the power of attorney. The trust override clause that had stopped the sale. The email where my father told the agent I had pre-authorized a transaction I never discussed with him. Not once, not ever. Then Robert mentioned, almost as an aside, the mortgage records he'd pulled while investigating the trust records that showed 2 years of automatic transfers from my account to my parents' mortgage servicer. $640. First of every month, for 23 months. My mother went pale. My father didn't say anything at all. Curtis looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in years. "That was you," Curtis said. "The refinancing thing. That was never a friend. That was you the whole time." I didn't say much. I told them the house on Newcastle wasn't for sale, and wouldn't be, and that going forward, any financial decision involving me would go through Robert's office, not a folder my father kept in a drawer. I told my mother I loved her, and that love wasn't the same as access. I told my father that stress didn't give him the right to decide my house was his to sell. I didn't need to raise my voice. The paperwork did the talking. Their own words, in their own emails, did the talking. 23 months of transfers no one ever thanked me for did the talking. My father's debt to his former business partner became a legal matter that no longer involved me or my house. I heard, secondhand through Curtis, that it took almost a year and a second mortgage on their own home to resolve. I still speak to my parents. I'm not interested in being the villain in this story, even though I had every reason, for a while, to want to be. But something shifted permanently the day I sat in Robert's office with a walker propped against my chair and watched my father realize that the daughter he assumed would never notice, never object, and never protect herself, had been protecting herself, and quietly protecting them too long before any of this happened. The lesson I keep coming back to isn't about revenge. It's about the difference between being generous and being invisible. I spent 2 years making sure my parents never had to feel the weight of their own mistakes. And in return, they decided my unconscious body in a hospital bed was an opportunity. I don't regret the help I gave them. I regret that I ever thought silence was the same thing as kindness. It isn't. Real protection, for the people you love and for yourself, has to be visible enough that no one can quietly rewrite it while you're not looking. If this story hit you somewhere real, you know what to do. Subscribe to Frontline Retribution, and don't forget to drop a comment below. I read every single one.